Welcome to Micro Homebrew in Kenmore, Washington for National Learn to Homebrew Day. Today we're going to go through all the steps and processes that are necessary to make your own great beer in your kitchen at home. So before we got here, we heated up some water. That's the first step. We wanted to save a little bit of time. We've got 3.5 gallons of water heated up in a 5-gallon kettle, just like you would do on your stove at home. Today we're going to make Mad Jack's Amber Ale. That's the National Learn to Homebrew Day official recipe. It's a nice Northwest amber ale, a little bit hoppy. It's real easy to make, real easy to drink. Generally speaking, if you go to your homebrew store, the recipes that you get will come in some sort of kit that are pre-put together. Everything's put together for you, so you have all the ingredients that you need. The equipment that we're using today is all stuff that's available in a standard starter homebrew kit. Kettle you may have already at home. The other stuff you'll see as we go along, you can purchase as a complete kit at your local homebrew store. I'll kind of open up the kit, go through some of the ingredients, get the process started, and then during that, while we're doing the brewing process, we'll kind of go over some of the other steps and procedures. Generally, when you open the kit, you'll have some instructions, good instructions that explain how to do the whole process. Some of the things you'll find in there is the malt extract. This is the base of our beer, and we'll talk more about that when we use it. The first thing we're going to use is actually the steeping grains. These are specialty barley that has been kilned or processed to give us the colors and flavors that we want in the beer. You can make a lot of different beers from the base extract. This specialty grains give us those extra colors and flavors that we need. In order to get those into the beer, we're going to start by steeping those in our water that we've heated to approximately 160 degrees. That temperature's variable. 150 to 160 degrees is fine. We want to just get the colors and flavors out of this barley. Most of the kits will come with a steeping bag. This is to contain all the grains so we can remove it after we've done that process. The trick is to just transfer them to that bag with it spilling as little as possible. Tie it off up at the top. Try to keep it as loose as possible so the grains can move around. And just put those in your hot water and try to get them as wet as possible. Mostly they can just soak, but periodically through the whole process we will move them around, agitate them to try to get it. You can probably see the color immediately starts to change. You're also extracting some specific flavors that give the beer the character that we want. So while those steep, and generally we'll steep those for about 15 to 20 minutes or so, we'll go over some of the other stuff that's in the kit and the other ingredients that you'll be using to make your beer. We touched briefly on the malt extract. This is basically the sugars from the malted barley that has been dried out so we can keep them shelf stable and we can use them in our beer. Additionally, we'll have the hops. We have this kit contains about 3 ounces of hops. These are used for flavoring, for bitterness. We'll talk more about that as we do it. We include some yeast nutrient and some clearing agents, and we'll discuss that as well. And then the yeast. Our kits come with dry yeast. There are many, many different types of yeast that we can talk about as well. We have some bags in this kit for our hop additions, and finally some sugar that we'll use to prime the bottles when we want to carbonate it at the end. Once we get the grains steeped and out of there, we'll add some of the extract to the boil kettle and we'll get it started to boil. During that process, during the boil time, we'll go over some of the other skills and some of the other steps that are involved with transferring your beer, fermenting your beer, bottling your beer. So you'll get an idea of seeing the whole process. Currently I've got it at about 160 degrees. Anywhere from about 140 to 160 is fine. The warmer temperature extracts the flavors better. We don't want it to get too hot because if you get it too hot, it starts to do damage to the husks. It can create some off flavors that we don't want in our beer. We'll probably abbreviate this just a little bit. It really is, there is no hard, fast rule about how long you're supposed to do this. The ultimate goal here is to get the flavors and the colors out. If we feel like we're getting the color that we want, we can pull them out early. If we feel like we're not getting the color that we want, we can leave them in longer. It's a little bit different than doing the whole process from grain, in that we have a lot of leeway. You can see that it has changed the color significantly from the water. I should touch on the water a little bit. We're just using our tap water here. Our tap water happens to be really good. Doesn't have a lot of minerals, doesn't have a lot of hardness. Essentially, the rule of thumb is if your tap water tastes really good, you can use it to make your beer, especially extract beers. The one concern that we do have in our area, of course, is some chloramine or chlorines in the water. That can add a flavor to your beer that you don't like. So we tend to treat for that either with a chemical process like a Campton tablet, or in this case, I just left it out overnight so that it would off gas. All right, well, this is looking pretty good. I'm going to grab something to take those out with, and then we'll go on to the next step. So we'll go ahead and pull out the grains. Want to keep it, go ahead and let it drain. Get as much out of there as we can. You can give them a good squeeze too and get as much out if you want to. Remember, it's 160 degrees, so be prepared for that. But generally, if you just let it drain good, you'll get out what you need to get out. There we go. Okay, so the next step now is to introduce some of the extract. This is one of the things that I wanted to talk about specifically. In this particular case, we have 7 pounds of malt extract. That's going to build the whole base of our beer. Because we're only boiling part of the beer right now, and we're going to add water later to finish it off, to finish our 5-gallon batch off, we're only going to add part of the extract. And the reason that we do that is if we put all of the extract in now that for the 5-gallon batch, there's too much sugars. It gets too thick, almost like a syrup, and it affects our boil. And most importantly, it'll affect how our hops get used, and won't give us the right flavor from our hops if it's too thick while it's boiling. So we'll just go ahead and we're going to add 4 pounds to the boil. You want to make sure your heat's off at this point, and go ahead and just stir that in. It dissolves pretty well, but there'll be some chunks. You want to make sure you get it all stirred in and dissolved. Once we get done with the boil, we'll add the rest of the extract in and complete our beer. Once we get it stirred up really good so that there's no chance of it sticking to the bottom, we'll turn the heat up high and we'll start working our way up to boil. That's the next step. Ultimately, we're going to boil it for an hour. During that process, we'll add the hops and any other ingredients that need to be in there. We'll add those during the boil process at various times based on the recipe. So we'll turn this on now. There's still a few floating pieces of it, you can see that, but we'll just keep stirring it in while we're heating up, make sure nothing sticks on the bottom. The reason we do just the small amount, the 3.5 gallons, and then add it later is so that you can do it on your stove. Most house stoves aren't going to be capable of boiling the 7 gallons that's necessary to make the full batch in one kettle. You can do it on like an outdoor burner, but that's a whole bunch of more equipment that's necessary, a bigger kettle, the burner, and those kind of things. So we like to show you how to do it on your stove, get you started on the process, see how good it can be, and then from there, the sky's the limit. There's all kinds of different things you can do and different beers you can make. Once we get this underway, we'll talk more about some of the other steps that'll happen to your beer after you've fermented it. We'll talk about some of the processes while this is boiling, so you know the other things that you're going to need to do. That's pretty good. The key, you definitely want to watch really close for any kind of boilovers. We'll keep the thermometer in here and keep an eye on it. When we start getting close to boil, we'll pay particular attention to it so we can turn it down. It is very sugary, so it tends to want to boil over, and you want to avoid that, of course. Mainly I'm just stirring this so you can see what's going on. We're already up to 180 degrees. You can see it's getting kind of foamy, so we want to watch for that overheating. We have a lot of control with this burner, so we can just turn it down real quick and go from there. On our recipe here, it talks about the hops that we're going to add. This particular beer has 2 hop additions during the boil. We'll add some hops when we start the boil, and then we'll add some in the last 5 minutes. And we'll talk about why we do those at that time. So we'll talk a little bit about the hops. Hops do a couple of things in beer. Number one, they give it the bitterness. Beer is inherently a little bit sweet because it is sugars, and you'll ferment most of those sugars out, but there's a lot left over. If you were to drink beer that just had no hops in it, was just made like this, it would be too sweet. So we add the hops for the bitterness. Generally speaking, the earlier in the boil that you add the hops, the more bitterness you get and the less flavors and aromas you get. So we're gonna have an addition. We're gonna boil this beer for 60 minutes. We're gonna put in our first charge at the beginning of that boil, and it's gonna boil for the full 60 minutes. So we're getting up to boil just now. You can see. So I turned the temperature down. We didn't want to get a boil over. What we're looking for is what's called the hot break. Once the possibility of boil over goes away, when the foam goes away and breaks into it, then we don't have to worry about it boiling over anymore. So we want to pay particular attention at this point. Make sure, because the last thing you want to do is boil over all this sticky sugar onto your stove. That is unpleasant. Although more than one person has gotten an outdoor brewing set for boiling over on their stove, on their wife's stove. So. So we're going to prepare our first hop addition when we keep an eye on that. In this particular case, this is an ounce of hops, and that's what we need. We need the whole ounce. Sometimes your recipes will call for partial ounces or multiple ounces, so you have to weigh those out. But in this case, it's a single ounce of this Centennial hops. We put these in a bag too. We want to contain them so we can get them out of the wort easy. That isn't strictly necessary. Truthfully, letting those hops get into your fermenter really isn't going to hurt anything. All that material will just drop to the bottom. But in the interest of keeping it as clean as possible, we're just going to put them in a bag, and then we can pull them out before we transfer it to our fermenter. 10:30. We're boiling at 10:30. We just drop those in, get them all wet, and let them go. We've set a timer so we know how long we've got to boil it. In this case, our next addition is actually going to be some yeast nutrient and some Irish moss. Yeast nutrient is pretty self-explanatory. Beer has a lot of stuff that yeast uses to grow and nutrients in the beer, but as added bonus or added, we add the yeast nutrient to give it everything, make sure it has everything it needs, make sure it has all the vitamins that it needs to give a proper fermentation. As long as yeast is healthy and happy, it'll go through it really well. It makes nice clean beers that you have all the time. Yeast that's stressed or doesn't have the proper temperature, which we'll touch on as well, can tend to leave some flavors that we don't like in beer. And then Irish moss, which we include in our pack too, is actually what's a clarifying agent. It binds with proteins that are in the beer. It helps them drop to the bottom during the fermentation process. That helps you have a kind of a clearer beer at the end. Both of these things are just insurance, extra insurance that we're going to get a nice clean beer. So the first thing I want to talk about is sanitization. Anything that goes into our beer pre-boil, of course, we're not particularly worried about. We want to be very clean and very methodical about it, but everything that goes in there is going to get boiled, and that's going to sanitize it for our purposes. But after we cool it down, we need to keep any kind of bacteria and microbes out of the beer that could cause it to spoil. Beer is basically sugar water, so it's very susceptible to that kind of stuff. So we have to go through some steps to make sure that what we use in the beer is sanitized. The easiest of those steps, and there are a lot of chemicals available, there are a lot of ways to do it. The easiest is a product called Starsan. Starsan is an acid-based sanitizer, a food grade that doesn't require any rinsing, so it works really good for our purposes. Well, it doesn't kill 100% of everything. For our purposes, it does a great job, and it's good enough to keep you from having any off flavors in your beer. The good thing too about it is it's very economical. We've got 5 gallons of tap water here, and we're just going to mix 1 ounce of the Starsan in there. We'll just mix 1 ounce in the 5 gallons, and basically we have 5 gallons of sanitizing solution here. The cool thing about Starsan is it doesn't go bad right away. You can use it over a period of time. We can use it for a lot of different things. And we're going to talk about transferring our beer, so we want to make sure everything's sanitary. So after you've fermented your beer for about the first week or so, I like to transfer it to another vessel for a number of different reasons. To get it off the yeast that has fallen to the bottom, and to help it clarify. I will tell you, and I'm sure people are already typing the question, the act of transferring it to a secondary fermenter has taken some bad raps in the last few years. There are some drawbacks to it. There's the possibility of an infection when you have it open, and the possibility of getting too much oxygen in your beer, which is one of the worst things you can do to a beer that's fermented, is get it oxygenated. That will cause it to stale very, very quickly. So for a lot of beers, this transfer is probably not necessary, but it is something that you definitely want to learn how to do. Because there will be situations where you want to transfer it onto the fruit like we talked about before, or you want to dry hop it and you want to get it off the yeast, or a beer that you want to age for a long time. I make a couple beers that sit in the fermenter for a year or 2 years. I don't want to leave all the yeast material and the break material and this stuff, the trub that has fallen out of the beer in there, so you transfer it over. So while you may not do it for every beer, it is something that's good to learn and make sure you know how to do it. So this represents our fermented beer. Basically it's sat in the fermenter now for about a week, and I'm ready to transfer it over. The first thing I'm worried about is the sanitization like we talked about. I'm going to transfer it over to a carboy, to this vessel. You can transfer it to another bucket, but the reason carboys work so well and the reason we include them in our kits is less airspace in the top. We can fill this up really far. We don't have to worry about the oxygen getting in there and causing our beer to go stale. In our bucket, we actually have a spigot on the bottom, so it works really handy, but you can just transfer it with a funnel or something like that. It doesn't take a lot. Truthfully, getting it with the Star San, it's really just a matter of getting it wet. In every place that it gets wet, after about 30 seconds to a minute, that's sanitized for our purposes. So that's really all there is to it, is making sure that you get Star San all throughout it, and then just drain it out. It creates a little bit of foam, and then you can see on the side there's a little bit of foam. That's absolutely not dangerous and won't flavor your beer, so don't worry about that at all. We also have our airlock and the stopper. We'll go ahead and sanitize those, and it's really, again, just a matter of putting it in here. Star San does say wear gloves. It is very gentle, but if you're sensitive to acids, things like that, it's probably a good idea to protect your hands. I've been doing this a long time and I haven't had any problem with it, so I don't worry about it as much. So that's basically sanitized now, and we can feel safe putting transferring our beer into it. Again, what we're doing here is a step that you would do after the fermentation process. We're doing it now because our beer is boiling and we have some free time. So the first step of transferring this over is also going to be to sanitize our auto siphon. And this is a device that helps us siphon a beer over to the other vessel without having to start the siphon manually, which is a really good idea. It has a cane that goes down in the tube, and it forces the liquid through the hose. So basically what I'm doing here is just putting some of the Star San through the hose, and that's going to sanitize it for our purposes. And then we just get rid of all of the sanitizer that's in there. Again, not worrying about the foam at all. Drain out the hose. And as long as this is wet, it stays sanitized for us. We want to make sure we don't touch the ground or anything like that. We're going to go ahead and put the hose down inside the vessel. Now, we talked a little bit about oxygen. The key here is to create as little oxygen as possible, and that means no splashing. The reason we don't pour it in there and that is because we want to avoid any kind of splashing. So we'll go ahead and put the siphon down in the beer. Make sure we're down as far to the bottom as we can get. This hose is a tiny bit short, as you can see. And then we'll go ahead and start the siphon. It's just pump it a couple times and get it going. and down to the bottom it goes. We're keeping it right on the bottom. We're trying not to splash it or shake it around or anything like that, and it just siphons its way out. If we had a lot of trub on the bottom, a lot of debris, we might have to hold this siphon up off that. You want to be careful to transfer as little material as possible. The whole point of doing this is to leave that material behind. This is a fake beer, so there's not much going on in there, but you can see what we're doing. We'll let that transfer all the way over because we want to use that vessel for our next demonstration. But assuming that we're transferring it to a secondary, then we leave it in there for another week or 2 weeks. There isn't any real set time. Once your fermentation is complete, and we'll talk a little bit about how to tell that, once your fermentation is complete, you can package the beer at any time. Beer, though, does benefit from a little bit of time to meld together. Yeast, even though it's done fermenting, will continue to clean up byproducts that it made during the process. So you never want to rush it. While people can get beers out in just a few days, I kind of go with about a 2-week timeline, 1 week in the primary, 1 week in the secondary for most ales like we're doing today, just to be sure that it's finished and to give it time to clean up and make sure that everything's the way that we want it. But if something comes up, it has to sit in that secondary for another week or 2 weeks, you're not hurting your beer at all. Just make sure you keep the temperature consistent and stable, and it'll work out great for you. We'll check what's going on over here. Still just boiling. I am boiling this one fairly calmly. You can see it's not a real heavy boil. A couple reasons for that. One is this, because we are boiling a small amount, we don't want to boil off too much, so we want to keep it a little bit slower. We don't want to boil off too much of this and have to add too much water back to it. It's just not really necessary with the extract. We're not trying to create any chemical processes or anything like that. Generally speaking, I would boil a little bit harder on an all-grain batch or at home, but again, whether it makes a better beer or a good beer, or makes the beer better or worse, is kind of up for debate. It really is more about changing things. Everything you change is going to change your beer in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make it bad. That's why I say earlier that beer's pretty forgiving. Some of the best beers that I've made came from some mistakes, and now I do that stuff all the time. So it works really well. Don't be too worried about it. One of the things we didn't touch on hops is thinking of the bacteria in it. Once your beer is fermented, it has the alcohol in it, so that helps protect it a little bit from bacteria too. But one of the other reasons we use hops is for their preservative properties. Hops were originally used because they preserve the beer. So a hoppy beer with some alcohol in it is even less susceptible to bacteria than it would be to oxidation. So I think oxidation is probably your biggest problem. We'll go ahead and get as much out as we can. At this point, if we had a bunch of debris at the bottom, we'd be watching to make sure we didn't suck it up. Better to leave that stuff in here than just transfer it over and defeat the whole purpose of what we're doing. The reason we use the 5-gallon fermenter is we want to get as much of the oxygen out as possible. So we filled this up farther than we have the bucket. There's a lot less headspace in there, so we don't have to worry as much about oxygen. If you do this at a week, like I talk about, there is still a little bit of yeast activity too, and yeast can help protect you from some oxidation. It uses oxygen in its process. So that little bit that's left on the top there, we're not too worried about, because it should fill rather quickly with the CO2 from the yeast fermentation process. We'll put the airlock on, and we fill the airlock with a little bit of Star San, our sanitizer, or some gin or vodka or something like that, and that will help keep any oxygen from getting in while still allowing the CO2 to get out of the product. And that would be what we have for secondary. We'd go ahead and put that back somewhere dark, where it's not going to get a lot of sunlight, and somewhere where the temperature is stable, and then let it sit for another week or a year, depending on the beer that you make. So we're about 20 minutes in. We'll talk about a couple more steps here. The next step for us is going to be bottling the beer. So we'll talk about bottling the beer from this fermenter. We'll talk about bottling next. So once your beer is sat in here for a week or 2 weeks or however long, you're going to want to bottle your beer. And part of that process is adding some sugar back to it to help it prime, to help it carbonate. Now, once all the sugars and everything are gone from here, the yeast is basically done. It's not going to create any more CO2. So we add a known amount of sugar to the process that the yeast can eat and create the CO2 that's going to carbonate your bottles. So what you have to do is mix that sugar with some water, generally about half a cup or so of water, which I'll go get that. You will add this water and the sugar together on another pan on your stove. You want to get the water boiling so it's sanitary and add it. We obviously only have the single burner here, so this is more just for demonstration purposes, just so you can see the process. But assume you've got it in a little saucepan and you've added, and you've got it up to boil. You just want to go ahead and stir in the sugar. Plus hot water is going to make it dissolve much quicker. You can even boil it for just a second, make sure that everything's sanitary on your stove. Get it all dissolved. And then you'll have a bottling bucket. Generally speaking, your bottling bucket is going to be the fermenter that you took the beer out of when you went to secondary. It's another good reason to secondary. Most of the kits come with a single bucket and a single carboy, so you can transfer that over. So you've washed your bottling bucket. You go through the process of sanitizing it again, just adding a little bit of Star San to it, and making sure that Star San gets on all the surfaces inside the bucket. You can put a lid on and shake it up, but just make sure you get all the surfaces wet with the Star San, and then you know that bucket's sanitized. We'll take our auto siphon again, and we'll make sure that that's all sanitary. I didn't clean this out. We're trying to speed up the process here a little bit, but you're doing this 2 weeks later, so it's nice and clean. Make sure you're all sanitized again, and get ready to transfer it over. Just like we did before, we're going to transfer it to the bottom of that bucket from our carboy. But the difference this time is we want to include the priming sugar that we created on our stove. And we need to get that priming sugar mixed into the beer as evenly as possible without a bunch of oxygen. So one of the easy ways to do that is add just a little bit, add like half of your priming sugar and hang on to part of it. And then start the siphon on the bottom of the bucket with it on the side so it swirls when it's going in. And you can see it's swirling and it's mixing in that sugar as it goes in. And we'll let that fill about halfway, and then we'll add the rest of the priming sugar. Try to get as even as possible. If you get beers that some are carbonated, some aren't, or some are over-carbonated, some are under-carbonated, you're getting too much, you're not getting the sugar spread out enough in your beer. One of the items you can use are sugar pills. We have those available at the store. Most homebrew stores do. They're a measured amount of sugar that you can add to individual bottles. That's probably a little bit easier, but corn sugar has been a tried and true method for a long time, so it's usually included in most of the kits. It also gives you the ability to control the control the amount of carbonation. If you don't like it as carbonated as maybe they're coming out, you can use a little less of the sugar, or you can use a little bit more sugar. So it gives you a lot of control over the carbonation that way. Keeping an eye on this. We've already boiled now for about 30 minutes. So we're getting close. Our next edition is in about 20 more minutes. Again, we may speed that up a little bit if we run out of things to talk about or run out of questions, but that's when we'll add our next edition. So it's still spinning. You can see it's still spinning. Can they see it's still spinning? They can't see it's still spinning anymore, but it's still spinning. So we go ahead and add the rest of the priming sugar in there to allow it to continue to We don't need to go and transfer the whole thing, but what you would do is just go ahead and transfer it all out. Again, leaving as little or taking as little debris as possible, particularly when you're putting it in your bottles. You want it as clear as possible. So you want to leave as much debris on the bottom as you can. So now you've got your bottling bucket. You'd be full of your beer. It's got the sugar in it, ready to go. If you don't feel like you got it mixed in good enough, feel free to take a sanitized spoon and really carefully stir it up, get it as in there as possible. We don't want oxidation, but we also don't want some bottles to have a whole bunch of sugar and some bottles to have very little sugar. Particularly on a beer that you're going to drink rather quickly, like this amber, oxidation doesn't necessarily have time to get too bad if you're very careful. So again, beer's forgiving, but just always be conscious of sanitization and oxidization. Bottling's a really simple process. We've got a bucket, we've got a spout on it. Most of the buckets that you'll have from your store are going to have a spout too. We're going to use a device called the bottling wand. We want it to sanitize as well, so we put it down in there. There's a little button on the end of it, that allows the liquid out. So you want to make sure you push that down and get the star sand throughout the whole thing. And then you just attach that to your spigot. Bottle caps and the bottles need to be sanitized. If you're getting fresh, clean bottles and new bottles, it's just a matter of putting them in some star sand, getting them wet with the star sand, making sure all the surfaces are coated. And then you can just put them on some sort of rack to dry. Make sure that they're all sanitized and drained out. Back to the foam, you can leave that foam inside there. It doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't add anything to the flavor. I tend to go through and do all of my bottles, get them all ready to go. A 5-gallon batch will take 2 cases of 12-ounce bottles or 2 cases of 22-ounce bottles. So 48 to 50 12-ounces, 24 or 26 22-ounce bottles. Flip top bottles work great. There's lots of different choices, but these are just the most economical. And then you need your caps. Get rid of this stars in. Caps you can put in a little bowl with the sanitizer. Make sure they're sanitized as well. We'll sanitize a couple just for the process here. Get this out of the way. Once you have your sanitized, you good there? Yeah. Once you have a sanitized bottle, you're going to go ahead and turn on your spigot. Because of the stopper on the bottom there, you might get a few drips, but it doesn't continue to run. You go ahead and put the bottle up on there, push the plunger down, and you can see it fills the bottle up. We're going to fill it right to the top. We're filling from the bottom so we don't have the agitation and causing the oxygen. We'll fill it right up to the top, and then we'll pull it down. Once we pull it down, you can see it leaves just the right amount of headspace for us. Just a matter of putting a cap on there or putting it on here. There's a little magnet that holds it in place. Get down over it and push it down. That's all there is to it. One more time. That's all there is. And you've got your beer bottled up. So now we want that beer to condition and carbonate. That's going to involve about 2 weeks of room temperature. So you don't want to put it in the refrigerator yet. You want to put that somewhere dark where it's basically room temperature. And the yeast that's still in suspension, and there is a little bit still in suspension, will eat up the sugars in there, and they'll cause the carbonation, cause the CO2 that will be carbonate your beer. After about 2 weeks, you can go ahead and put them in your refrigerator, and then pop them open and drink them once they're cold. A lot of you probably had some bottle fermented beer, there will be a fine layer of that yeast on the bottom. You want to be careful not to pour that out. You want to pour very carefully when you decant it to a glass, but that's all there is to it. We talked about transferring to a secondary, the needs for that. If not, we went through the process, keeping in mind our sanitation and keeping the oxygen down. And we talked about bottling the beer. So that's kind of the finishing steps for your beer. And now here in just a few minutes, we'll start moving towards finishing up the boil part of it too. So let's see, kind of to recap, we've been boiling now for about 40 minutes, 42 minutes. I think we'll kind of move along, assume that we're getting near the end of that. We talked about the Irish moss and the yeast nutrient. With 10 minutes to go in the boil, we're supposed to add this in. So we'll go ahead and add that to it. It really is just as simple as dumping it in there, adding it to it. It will clump up a little bit. Make sure you stir it in. Some yeast nutrients work differently. And then we had a question about Whirlfloc. That's just a tablet you'll toss in there in place of the Irish moss, and it'll just dissolve on its own. And then we'll go about 5 more minutes, and then we have our final hop addition, 1 ounce of Cascade hops. The reason we add hops late in it, we talked about the bitterness from the early addition of hops. The reason we add hops late into the process is to retain the flavors and the aromas. The later in the process, the more flavors and aromas that you'll retain. 5 minutes will give us a good mix of those flavors. Maybe a little tiny bit more bitterness, but not to the level of IPAs. Generally IPAs, things with a lot of hop flavor and bitterness, will actually add a bunch of hops after the boil and during the dry hop that we talked about at the beginning. And we'll go over that again too. But the later in the addition that you add it, the more flavors and aromas you retain with less bitterness. So that's kind of a good guideline. So just like we did before, our 5-minute addition, we're going to put in a hot bag so we can add it to the boil. We're using the whole thing again because that's what the recipe calls for. And just add it in there, set our timer for 5 more minutes to go, and then our beer will be ready to cool down. Okay, to recap a little bit, we've been boiling what we're going to call 1 hour, a couple more minutes to go. That's what the recipe calls for in this beer. We did touch on a little bit, that is kind of an arbitrary number, but most recipes tend to go with an hour. You can make adjustments and boil for a shorter time if you'd like. You can make adjustments and boil for a longer time. Both of those options will add different flavors to your beer. There's not a good one or a bad one. They're just going to be different. So that's the beauty of it. It's easy to learn this process. It takes a lot of brewing to perfect it. You know, do what you feel you want to try and see how it turns out and make your adjustments from there. We have about 25 different ones that we all make in-house. Everything from a blonde ale, a real light blonde ale, to juicy hazy IPAs, double IPAs. We have some British beers, pretty much everything that across the gamut of what you might want to make. Those are just our pre-made kits. Remember, this is just a recipe that we've put in a box. We have dozens of recipes. We can make pretty much any kind of beer that you want. We have those available, and you can just go on the internet and search for your favorite beer, and there's likely somebody's made a recipe that they think tastes a lot like it, and we can usually create that recipe for you too. If you're new to the hobby, the kits are excellent because of the instructions and because everything's collected in one place, and they're beers that are tried and true. We know that they work out great, but certainly don't be afraid to experiment and do it your own way. We're going to call this an hour. We'll go ahead and turn it off. I like to collect the hops out of it right now. Just makes it easier for us when we're stirring in the other extract. Just take the hops, drain out the sacks. Again, you could have just thrown the hops in. and strain them out when they go into your fermenter, or you could just put them in the fermenter. All things that work well for a lot of people. It just will change the beer. You'll just need to decide what you like the best for yourself. I like to just take these out so they're not in there. And we've turned off the heat. We're still at basically at boiling temperatures, and we're going to add the extra extract at this time. We talked at the beginning, if you were here at the beginning, we talked about not adding all the extract that your beer needs if you're only boiling a part of it. The reason for that is we don't want it to be too thick and not use the hops properly, not use the acids in the hops properly. That's one of the things that causes extract beers, people not to like them. You end up with some extra sweetness because the hops didn't create as much acid as they needed. So we go ahead and put this in at the end. No worry about the sanitization here because the extract itself, of course, is already sanitary or sanitized. And then we've just been boiling this beer. When we worry about it is when we start to get below 160 degrees. And that's not going to happen just from adding this in. So we're safe and good to go. Get that all mixed in. After we get this all mixed in, then comes the cooling part. We need to cool this wort down, and we need to cool it down as quickly as possible. That helps what's called a cold break. If you cool it down quick enough, some proteins and debris in there will fall out of the liquid, and it will end up as trub on the bottom of your fermenter. Again, there are also people who brew and they do what they call no-chill brewing, where they just leave it overnight to cool. As long as it's in a sanitary environment, that works well too. It will affect the hop usage because the hops that we put in here are still being isomerized, and we're still using some of the acids right now. But that's all things that you can work into your process to make it work for you. We're going to go ahead and chill this down. The way we would do this if we were at home in our kitchen is we just take this kettle and set it in the sink and fill around it with cold water and just keep stirring it. Keep your thermometer in there, keep an eye on where the temperature and everything is. And then when you get it down to about 90 degrees, that's going to be good enough for our purposes because we're going to add it to some chilled water, and I'll show you that too. If you are doing full volume where you've boiled the whole thing, or you're not adding chilled water, or you didn't chill your water down ahead of time, you need to get it down closer to what the yeast temperature is, so closer to 70 degrees, 68 or 70 degrees. That can take quite a bit of time in your sink. What we're going to do today is we're going to use an immersion chiller. It's a copper coil that we're going to put down in there, and we're going to run some water through the coil to help speed the process up, just so you don't have to watch water cool. We're going to move it over to where we can chill it. Again, normally we would just move this to our sink, but we're going to speed up the process just a bit. This is an immersion chiller, copper coil that we're going to use to chill it down. I've had it in the Star San that we talked about before. If you're using an immersion chiller and it's near where you're boiling, you can actually just add it to the last 5 minutes or so of the boil, and that will sanitize it as well. So we're not too worried about it bringing any kind of bacteria over because of the heat and the temperature, and I've sanitized this one. You just drop it down in there, and you start the water running, cold water running through it. This does use a bit of water, so in most cases, if I was at home and using this, I would catch that water in a bucket or in a sink that we could use it to clean and that sort of thing. But in the absence of that, we're just run it out right now. And then it's just a matter of watching the temperature. It helps to stir it, keep the wort moving the whole time. And stir it in the opposite direction that the water is running into the coil. That helps as well. You can see we talked about it. We're already down to about 170 degrees. So we don't have very far to go. We're shooting for about 90 today because we're going to go ahead and use some cold water to finish our process. If you don't have the chilled water, then you probably want to get it closer down to about 70 degrees. Even with the immersion chiller this size, it's still going to take us a couple minutes. Getting it down below 140 is pretty quick, and then it'll slow down a bit. So we're down to 100 degrees pretty quick. We'll just give it a couple more seconds here, and then I'll show you how we get ready for the fermentation. That'll continue to move on its own. While we're finishing the chilling down, we'll get prepared to ferment too. We have a fermentation bucket. I already sanitized this with the Star San earlier, so we're okay to go on that. And we're just going to transfer our wort into there when we get it cool. The key now we talked about was the cold water. I'm going to grab some of that real quick. I have 2 gallons of distilled water that I got at the store, and I've had in the cooler, so it's nice and cold. It doesn't have to be distilled water. It could be the spring water, or it can be your house water as well. But you want to boil it the night before so it's sanitary, and make sure it's in sanitary containers. It's convenient to use these for our process. And what we're going to do, since we know we've got about 3.5 gallons in our bucket, after the boil, we're going to add 2 gallons in here. Ultimately, what we're trying to get is about 5.5 gallons in our fermenter, because we're going to lose half a gallon or so with the trub and the hop debris and everything that falls to the bottom, the yeast and all that kind of thing. And the goal is to get a full 5 gallons worth of beer. You want to add this to the bucket first and not add the wort and then add it in. This is a physics problem that probably somebody could explain to me, but if you add it first and then add the hot wort on, it'll chill it down. If you try to pour this into the hot wort, it won't chill it down. So if you don't believe me, try it, because I've tried it both ways, but I'm sure there's a reason for it. So we add it in there first. Keep the lid on it when you're not around so it keeps sanitized. And we're down to 90 degrees. So we'll shut off the water, take our chiller out. Don't need the thermometer anymore. And it's as simple as moving this to your fermenter and pouring it in. You can put a strainer on there if you wanted to try to collect stuff, or if you left the hops in it, but it's not necessary. It's just a matter of pouring it in to what you've got already. Getting up to the 5.5 gallon mark. We'll check where we're at. Sometimes we have to add a little bit more water. Now we definitely want to stir it up at this point. 2 things happen. We want to make sure that we get all the water stirred into the wort. That'll help with the temperature. And it also, we're going to take a reading of the sugars in our wort and make sure we're where we're supposed to be. So you have to have it really good, really homogenized, really stirred together. Also, all that talk about no oxygen at this particular time is not important. Yeast needs oxygen to do its job, so we want to whip some oxygen into this too. Make sure we get as much oxygen into it as we can right now for the yeast to do its growth phase and to ferment your wort, be healthy when it ferments your wort. So we talked a little bit about the sugars. One of the steps we're going to do is we're going to test our sugars in our beer. The sugars are what the yeast is going to eat to make the alcohol. And so how much sugars we start with gives us an idea of how much potential alcohol we have and how much sugars we finish with, because the yeast won't eat it all. We can use those two numbers, the beginning and the start and the ending one, to determine how much alcohol is in the beer. The easiest way to take that, you can pour some out of your kettle when you're doing it, take a sample. The easiest way is with a device called the Thief. We've sanitized this, so we can just put it down in the beer and take a sample of what we've mixed together. We take a sample of it and we go ahead and put it in our test tube, which I've also sanitized in case I have to take another sample. Okay. Hopefully that'll be enough. We should be all right. This is a hydrometer. This will come with your kit as well. It's actually what we use to measure the sugars. It's kind of hard to see on here, but you can go on the internet and you can see steps on how to read it. It starts at 1.000, that's water, no sugars at all, and it floats higher in the liquid based on how much sugar is in it. So we drop that into the liquid and we let it sit. And then we can read on the device, we can read it. Right now we're sitting at 1.070, which is actually a little bit high. That is most likely because I haven't stirred it up enough. We're supposed to be at 1.061, so I probably didn't stir it up enough beforehand. The good thing about the kits is if you're using the proper amount of water and you're using the proper amount of extract that comes with the kits, you're going to hit your numbers okay. I don't know if we can see any of that. The main time that we're really going to worry about it with these kits is at the end of the fermentation. After we put the yeast on and it's fermented for those 2 weeks, we're going to want to take a sample and see where it is. After 2 weeks, it's almost always complete. And in this particular case, we should be down at about 1.015, and that'll leave us with an alcohol of about 6%. If you're doing it early, if you're trying to put it in your bottles early, the worst thing you can do is put it in the bottles when it's still fermenting, because in addition to the sugar you added, there's still sugar in there. They can get over-carbonated and actually burst the bottle. So you want to be really careful about that. If you're trying to speed the process up and you want to make sure that your fermentation is complete before you bottle it, take a sample, take the reading, and then 3 days later, take another sample, or 2 days later, take another sample. If the readings are identical, then it's probably stopped fermenting and you're probably safe to bottle. If it's gone down a little bit, you're going to want to wait another couple days and check another sample. That's where people talk about bottle bombs, and that's almost always the culprit, is trying to bottle it too early. So if you can be patient and wait the full 2 weeks, that's going to give you the best chance. If you can't be patient, make sure you're doing your tests and checking it out. So if we're happy with that, and we've got the proper temperature, just to confirm, we'll take just a sample just to see if we're at the right temperature. But if we did everything the way we were supposed to, we should be fine. Yeah, right about 68 degrees. So we went from 90 to 68 degrees just by putting it on 2 gallons of chilled water. The next step is putting it somewhere where it's going to ferment. You don't want to have to move it after you pitch the yeast. So definitely put it somewhere where you're going to ferment it. A closet, somewhere where you've got some sort of way to control the temperature, anything like that. The key is stable temperatures. We have lots of different yeast that can work for lots of different temperatures, but the key is all yeast has its kind of favorite yeast temperatures or favorite fermentation temperatures, so you want to tailor it to your situation. If you've got a garage that's always 50 degrees this time of year, you can make some lagers. If you like your house super hot and it's always 80 degrees in your house, you can make some saisons and Belgian beers, that kind of stuff. The yeast we're putting in this is an English ale yeast. It does its best work between about 64 and about 72 degrees. If we're well below that, we'll get a cleaner beer, but it will go very, very slowly. If we go too much above that, we start to get fruity flavors, characters that can be not proper for the beer, to the point where they get not good if you go too much. So temperature control is kind of one of the most important things we talk about here, and it's probably one of the most important things you can do to help your beer is control that temperature. We have lots of different options for that, from very, very simple to very complex or very expensive. But really the main thing is just know your space and know where it's going to stay. So As far as pitching the yeast with the dry yeast, the reason I say put it where you want it to go is we're just going to sprinkle these yeasts on the top and let them soak into the beer and hydrate themselves. We don't want to move it around or stir it after we've done that. So it's just a matter of sanitizing the outside of these packs. Put them down in your Star San so that they get sanitized. Not a bad idea to sanitize your scissors as well. And it's just a matter of taking the tops off and sprinkling them in. Be sure and just take them and sprinkle them across the top. Try to cover as much of the surface as you can. It doesn't matter if they clump up a little bit. Again, we're going to let that just sit there. And over the next 20 minutes or so, that yeast is going to drop in, rehydrate, and start doing its job. Seal up your bucket and install the airlock. Hopefully we've sanitized your airlock. There's a little line on it right there that you want to fill it up to. Again, you can use Star San to fill it up, or I have a bottle of gin that I keep to fill them up because I like the pine character of it. Put that in there. Make sure your airlock's filled up. And generally within 12 to 24 hours, you're going to start seeing some activity, going to start bubbling up through there. One thing to be aware of is some yeasts can get very aggressive. This one we're not going to have too much trouble with, but if you don't have enough head space in there, the foam that they create can come up through the airlock. It can plug up the airlock and cause back pressure that can actually blow the lid off there. So you want to be aware of that and make sure that you keep that clear. We can also recommend a tube, bringing a tube off it and into a bucket of water so the yeast can get out. But most of the places like here, we'll warn you if that's a yeast that you're getting. Or be sure to ask if we're worried about blow off. These buckets are like 7 gallons for a reason, so there's lots of head space. For most fermentations, you'll be fine. So, in conclusion, we're Micro Homebrew. We're in Kenmore, Washington. We're a full-service homebrew supply shop. We love to talk about beer and help you make your best beer. Just come on in and see us.